Welcome everyone to episode 4 of Cosmic Collab. I'm Olivier, co-founder at Optimate. Today we're in a treat as we dive into the inspiring journey of Finmo. I'm thrilled to introduce our guest of today, David Hanna. David is the Chief Executive Officer of Finmo and co-founder. Finmo is the first all-in-one treasury operating system. Before founding Finmo, David was with Rappi, gaining invaluable experience, and also a seasoned compliance expert. David, welcome. I'll be happy to hear more about your journey and really delighted to have you today.
Thanks, Ollie. Good to be here.
So, David, maybe let's start with sharing your journey. How did you end up creating Finmo? What brought you there? What made you decide to take the path of an entrepreneur as a co-founder of a startup?
Absolutely. I think it's a question I get a lot, given my background. And so I think, as you mentioned, I have a fairly deep sort of career in regulatory risk, compliance, and sort of control functions. So prior to founding Finmo, I was in various global chief risk officer and compliance roles for payment companies, from Rapid, as you mentioned, as an early employee at Rapid, helping them sort of expand their offering and looking at things like acquisitions and whatnot. And prior to that was with PayPal for 6.5 years, where I worked through sort of Australia and Asia and on interesting projects like in Europe through their Luxembourg bank and sort of the US. And then prior to that was with Ernst & Young on the advisory side, of which PayPal was a customer of mine. And so as an advisor at the time, really started working with PayPal as they started to challenge the thinking, as the original fintech of that time. They, were pushing boundaries and trying to sort of, really, I think, innovate in the true sense of the word at such an early period of time. And so with early innovation comes some, potential risks and, testing of the regulatory boundaries. And so as a customer of mine, they actually got into a bit of strife in Australia and a couple of other markets. And so I found myself hopping into kind of them as an organization and running a lot of their regulatory and risk sort of functions. So that's kind of me in a nutshell. It's been 20 years of that. And now I'm, really excited to be, leading commercially from an executive perspective, Finmo globally. And I think, look, part of why I think I'm here now is really from a risk and compliance perspective and sort of understanding, the regulatory sort of environment across the globe. It kind of gives you a good balancing, sort of threshold, if you like, is kind of the way that I would look at it, which is knowing essentially, when it is too far or too close to, as I would say, to the electric fence, versus, building a business and pushing sort of innovation and, working with new interesting models and so on and so forth. So in fact, I think that the regulatory background gives me a very good balance in that regard. And at the end of the day, the thing that Finmo focuses on is treasury management, which involves client funds, regulated statuses, licensing globally. And so it's an interesting background to help sort of tackle some of those problems, I think.
We can relate to that. So what was when you created Finmo in 2021, when you launched Finmo with a number of other co-founders, how did that come about? Did you know each other? How did the idea came about and saying we're going to revolutionize the way treasury ops are done, and this is our roadmap, this is what we're going to do, and how did that come together?
So Finmo was born out of a deep desire to, really solve this global treasury problem, right? One day, frankly, I phoned up two of the kind of original co-founders and said, look, from my perspective, I'm really sort of tired of doing it for someone else. We've got the skill set, we've got, what it takes in terms of, the inquisitive mindset, the sort of perseverance and so on and so forth. And again, I think there's a little bit of that through kind of the regulatory mindset of knowing problems arise and you can tackle it. And there's always a solution to a problem. Why don't we do it for ourselves, right? And so Finmo was born one afternoon after that phone call. And so, yes, it was absolutely with friends and co-founders that, that were familiar with each other, that had, certainly the same mindset of getting things done, persevering and pushing through. And as I say, because of the roles that we have held, we saw the common consistent problem that wasn't being solved, which is basically the CFO office, right? The reality is that in a globalized world, where you have money being collected and distributed sort of globally in different currencies, etc., with organizations that have multi-org structures, across the globe, because it is a global day one sort of environment. The reality is that everyone has a treasury problem, right? Because if you contrast it against that backdrop, even payment companies, find it difficult to sort of understand how much I'm collecting in a particular market, what the currency is, what the outlook of the currency is, how do I get cash management visibility through 20 to 30 to 50 bank accounts that I'm holding across the globe. And so Finmo is really all about bringing that treasury kind of platform together so that treasurers and CFOs can have a single view of what their cash position is, how can they optimize for a return on their excess cash that's sitting dormant, how can they get better FX and sharper FX in a forward-looking basis rather than just a spot sort of FX basis, and how can we do this whilst posting to our accounting software and our ERP tools, etc. Because the reality is that each step that I just described is currently done on single platforms that are disjointed and disconnected from one another, and the treasurers and CFOs are pulling their hair out because they don't know how to. There's no necessarily answer or tool that sort of brings it together. So that's the problem that we're solving. That's the problem that we saw for over a decade, and the fact that the co-founders sort of had the requisite skills. I mean, myself from a regulatory perspective, we've got sales folk, we've got network folk, tech, product, compliance, etc. It meant that it was a relatively easy decision, frankly, because often in a startup world, you don't have the tech person or the product person or the compliance person or what have you. So it kind of made it quite easy to come together and say, hey, got the skill set, there is a problem, it is solvable. Can we do it in a unique way that marries sort of the software elements of treasury with money movement payment capability? And let's go out and sort of do it. So it sounds easy now playing it back, but certainly that was our philosophy and still is at the time, at this current time. It's funny, I was at a conference sort of last week and in Bangkok, and one of the CFOs came up to me and said, this is quite literally what I do. I start my day logging into the bank accounts, understanding the positions, trying to figure it out, and sort of, and going from there, right? So we're tackling a real problem for people. And look, to your point, treasury was never sexy, right? It's a bit like compliance and regulatory, right? It's not the sexy thing. It's not the front and center fun thing like it is in a commercial world or what have you. For a lot of people, right? It's the necessary sort of thing to get right, absolutely. But it's spreadsheets and databases and so on and so forth, right? So I think what we're trying to do is, bring the sexiness back to the treasury function, but also do it in a way that is sort of single point of view, right? So that joking aside, in doing that, it gives the kind of treasurer and CFO a much better handle on their global operations than it would literally logging in bank account to bank account. So that's kind of our philosophy and thesis.
Of course, Finmo is regulated. I think you've got an MAS license here in Singapore, in other countries as well. So I'd be interested to understand a little bit the journey behind it, because you're fintech, as a proper fintech, and there's no other way around it, to describe it. How did you grow? When do you decide to get the license? How easy it is and particularly with your, I would say, background, heavily compliance focused. When do you decide, no, we need to get this before we do anything, or is it more like, let's, inch by inch start doing things? And I'd be interested. I'm quite curious to understand the journey there in terms of getting regulated and in which markets.
In terms of the regulatory component, the reality is that we've got a bit of grey hair as founders, and so we unfortunately have gone through this in the past. And so I always say it's not our first rodeo, and so on and so forth, right? And so quite literally, as we founded the company in 2021, I essentially, and again, given my background, would lodge all the license applications almost at once, right? So we're now an FSP in New Zealand, we're a regulated entity in Australia. We're regulated in Singapore as a major payment institution. We're regulated in the US at a federal level as an MSD. And so all of that was done essentially from day one, because the reality is that we knew that handling client funds, handling global treasury flow requires us to be as regulated as possible. And so given my background, I actually see that as a pro-business thing. Regulation, compliance, partnering with regulators and central banks is paramount. It's critical to what we do. And we actually want to go after the most regulated markets. That's actually our philosophy internally, right? Like, we don't want sort of the loosely regulated regimes, et cetera. We want our platform to be as robust and independently tested and verified as absolutely possible. So at the moment, you might laugh at this, but I've got license applications in with the Dubai DFSA, with the HK as an MSO, with Canada, now that their website is back up, because interesting story, there was a security breach from a regulatory perspective in Canada, which meant that their website was down for some time. So now that that's back up, UK as an FCA EMI, and also Poland as our European play, right? In terms of an EMI across, or it's actually an API in Poland that gives us European access. So from our perspective, that gives us enough kind of comfort that handling, billions and quite a wide variety of customer funds will, set us up for the future, right? And so I think, look, your question of whether it's hard and difficult, etc. Absolutely. Look, there's no doubt about it. It takes a lot of effort. You need to know sort of the local nuances. You need good people in the compliance and regulatory team that have great expertise in handling this. There are local nuances, but one thing I would say is that regulators, in my mind, are becoming a lot more proactive, a lot more consistent, actually, which is what I would, say is one of the reasons why it makes it a lot easier. I'm not saying it's super easy, but it makes it easier because there's kind of an international standard on regulation now, right?
So you would, if you just had to choose, it makes it easier. The more you do, the more you interact with regulators, the more regulators you have to deal with. It makes it easier because you have some element of a standard, and I guess it's becoming more and more similar, right? Because I mean, intuitively, it sounds contradictory, but I think there is, of course, a push for global standardization, and which should be the case, right? We would want eventually to have a global compliance passport where you would go from one country to another country and be able to use the same documents, the same standards. So I think we're getting there. But how is it, however, to deal on because you still need to do reporting in each and every country, right?
For sure.
So
and it's interesting on reporting, right? So from our perspective, one of the things that again, all lessons learned, right? Like it's really interesting in that, at least you learn from these things and you sort of move forward. But on reporting, you're absolutely right. It's an aspect that needs to be done well, right? It needs to be a well-controlled environment, particularly if you're handling client funds and so on and so forth. And so for me, from day one, it's all about, as we get a license, let's figure out the reporting requirements, of which we kind of know from our prior lives, and let's build it into the platform from sort of a quote-unquote back office perspective, right? And what I mean by that is, instead of doing things like manual reporting, etc., every time we go to a new market, we will understand the monthly, quarterly, semi-annual, annual reporting requirements, build it into our offering so that our compliance team isn't sort of wondering what they need to collect, how much, when, and so on. And so it actually gets ingrained into the DNA of our platform, which actually means that the compliance team can almost, quote unquote, push a button and a report is generated for the Singapore MAS requirements or the Australian IFTI regulations on a weekly basis, or whether it be the US component, etc. So one of the things that I've tasked the compliance team with is continuing that mindset. Every time we expand, let's ensure that it's built into the core of what we do. What are the reporting requirements? How do we need to manage it? And let's get proactive around that and how we build it into kind of the operational activity that happens day to day, month to month. There's a lot of heavy lifting that is required in that regard.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, when you look at legacy, I would say service providers like banks, bank regulation, how much is invested just to comply, which is a big challenge for banks, and that's why they've started operating slightly differently, turning away clients, really focusing on very specific type of products as opposed to becoming, servicing any type of entity, focus on profitability. So 2021, founders come together. You've got this idea. We're going to solve the problem of global treasury operations. Is the product as it is right now already what you had envisioned in 2021, or where has it evolved? Your first clients? I'd like to hear a little bit more about the journey and on the product itself.
For sure, Ollie. Look, I think in terms of product vision, it's funny because we have had a relatively lengthy career already from a founder perspective. We sort of are relatively clear on what we're solving, and so I think that's helped in terms of sort of framing the problem and therefore the solution. I think what has evolved is sort of how we put the pieces of the puzzle together, so to speak, right? And what I mean by that is, we have now a clearer, modularized approach to what we're doing, right? Now, prior in the early days, it might have been more of a general vision of solving treasury for kind of the end-to-end, CFO experience and so on and so forth. I think what evolved over time is sort of putting those elements or features into buckets, if you like. And so internally, we talk about 4 core modules at Finmo. Money movement, which is a bucket, cash management, which is a bucket, FX, and then there's integrations. And so I think that's really important from a Finmo perspective, that we're now very clear on the quote unquote buckets. We now talk to our customers about kind of what modules, would help solve the problems that you're seeing. And I think that's made it even easier to kind of have the conversation. So if I'm talking to a traditional payment platform, as an example, that might just want money movement capability, no problem. We can sort of open up that bucket, so to speak, and talk about the features that we've got. If there's other scenarios where it's more about sharper FX and hedging and sort of forward-looking basis, etc., we can also have that conversation. So I think the evolution's been sort of more clearly defined sort of modules that now help us have conversations with clients to solve particular problems. And the team are really kind of focused on that. Every time we get on a call with a client, it's more about, well, what is it that you're, what problem do you have now, and how can we solve it, right? Let's map it back to one of the modules and figure out, what is solvable, rather than just a one size fits all or something else. So I think that's been quite helpful in terms of how we've evolved.
I can testify to that because we've been using Finmo and I've been interacting with your teams. And indeed, from day one, when I went onto the portal, I didn't realize it because I'm not a treasury expert. But you're right, you've got these 4 modules, right? FX, integrations, money transfers, which was the one we were interested in. And yes, put it this way, yes, I actually, it makes a lot of more sense when I look at the platform and how it's been designed. So thanks for sharing this. It does help from day one. You really know that, and you don't have to take a year or two to get to that point where you know that. So I think that's, for any startup, that's definitely already an acceleration into the process of building your product.
And don't take that as we don't have any problems or there's never a dull moment at Finmo. Certainly there's been challenges, but look, I think clarity of vision, I think, is really important. I think going after a particular problem that you want to solve is important, and we've sort of huddled around that as a team. And I think as you say, we're very blessed and grateful for clients like yourself, Ollie, and others that work with us. And we're always trying to definitely kind of, again, solve problems, but adjust where we can, right? And so to your point, we can't always necessarily build everything for everyone, but I think one of the principles internally is, again, along the lines of the modularized approach, is having a flexible platform that kind of allows you to solve different use cases. So in your use case of the SPV, kind of offering, having a flexible wallet solution as an example is quite key, to your business. And so we've built the platform in a way that sort of allows for that, as opposed to a sort of, again, one size fits all or a rigid sort of approach to things. So we definitely take that philosophy, internally and try and live by it.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit more about Finmo, your journey. So what's next in terms of of your expansion plans, in terms of, well, you've really got the vision for the product. I guess it's more gaining more market share globally. What's 2025 going to look like for Finmo?
Yeah, absolutely. No, good question, Ollie. And it's something that we're, as a management team, starting to think pretty heavily on right now, right? So we're actually having a company offsite in the last week of November. The management team are coming together a couple of days before that. We're going to kick off the kind of annual planning process. We normally then have our planning for the new year, ready for the rest of the team as of January. And so from our perspective, we're doing a lot of thinking about what 2025 looks like. I think I gave a little bit of the kind of insight into the market expansion, the licensing that we're going after. So definitely on that aspect, we are full steam ahead. But you're right, we have worked with a number of investors. We've raised 8.5 million to date. We have some good investors that work with us that understand sort of the direction that we're going after. And look, we are in a fundraising kind of mode right now. So coupled with the planning, we're also trying to raise funds, etc. And we found actually that, again, there's partners and investors out there that sort of understand the problem that we're going after. And so we've been grateful to kind of connect with like-minded investors that want to also solve this problem. And it's funny, one of the investors I had a conversation with, not so long ago, I kind of said to him, look, we're actually building your thesis, right? So it feels like a match made in heaven because you guys write about the problem and we're actually building it, practically, right? So I think from an environment perspective, I think if you find the right partner that truly understands the problem that you're going after, then you're kind of halfway there, right?
It's pretty impressive. And I think you've hinted at the fact that as a team that has a seasoned team of operators, of being there, from day one, you knew what you needed to do to grow quickly and so it didn't take a first year of finding the foot ground. What is the product going to look like? What is the market really going to look like? So you've already put that away. Not that easy for first time founders, young founders, right? That coming with an idea of and a market and a problem to solve. I think this is probably where with Finmo as a team, you set yourself apart from, I would say, a more youthful startup. So certainly that must help.
No, it's funny. I tell the story of one of our investors. I'm sure he won't mind me saying this, but his question to me before he actually invested was, "Are you sure you want to do this so late in the piece?" To which I didn't know how to respond. I mean, I knew I had grey hair, but I didn't think I was that old. But no, certainly, look, I'm blessed. We are all blessed at Finmo for having such an experienced team and people. Every day our Finmo Nords are solving problems. They're coming up with new ideas, and I truly believe we have a really solid best-in-class team across every function, right? So couldn't be more blessed in that regard. And look, it's a tough journey, right? Like you need to also understand that people also have aspirations and so on to do different things, and we always hope at Finmo that we can kind of give you the opportunity to kind of innovate and fulfill those aspirations, but sometimes it's not as easy as that, right? So there's always been, I don't want it to paint the picture of just being rosy. I mean, certainly we've had our fair share of challenges, but I think the experience, the kind of the bench strength of the team, I think definitely helps push us in the right direction for sure.
And beyond the team, and I want to talk about, actually, you're talking about talent, you're talking about having strong Finmo Nords that you've mentioned, that are solving problems every day. Recruiting the right people for the right functions, keeping them engaged, particularly for business. We for example mostly work from home, to keep the teams engaged, to make sure things are moving ahead. It is a challenge, and it's something. So anything, what can you share as a seasoned operator?
I think one of the things that I guess maybe some of the next things that I'm about to say might sound a bit cliche, right? But the reality is that alignment is key, right? So starting with like the annual planning process, making sure that everyone's clear, to your point, on what the year sort of entails, and at least putting kind of something on the board that says we want to achieve these things, right? And sharing that transparently with the team, I think gives a sense of purpose, right? I understand why I'm here, I understand what I'm doing, and I know that the activity that I'm doing day to day aligns back up to one of the strategic objectives of the company, right? And so I think that's the first thing. I think then at a kind of more people level, we are super transparent. It's one of the things that I love about Finmo. Internally, our CFO gets up at the all hands that we have once a quarter and shares the results, shares the numbers, shares all of it, right? And so from our perspective, we've probably all worked in a company where we're not quite sure, is it moving in the right direction? Is it not? Is it, what are we doing? And so on and so forth. So I think one of the fundamental things is people just want to know. People just want to be connected. They want to feel a sense of purpose. They want the transparency. We have Ask Me Anything, sessions, all the good things that you hear about, but we're practically doing them. So I think there's that level. And then I think there's just, people want to be treated, frankly, like people. And it sounds, again, cliche, but, we regularly catch up leaders with, teams, cross-functionally, et cetera. And that's one of the things as a core management team, we sort of have to drive and put effort into in ensuring that you're not just looking after your patch, right? You're kind of going across function, you're checking in with people, you're understanding if there's problems, you can solve them, you could be a helping hand, et cetera. So again, that's why I said at the beginning, it might sound all cliche, but I think that the elements of those put together really make it an open, transparent, hopefully fun place to work. Because on the fun side, we also celebrate our wins, right? So we do things like the Finmo Premier League, as an example. And when a few of us head over to India, where we have our Bangalore office, and a lot of our developers and engineers are based there, we get up early one morning and we set the teams out and we say tech versus product versus compliance versus business. Let's do a league. Let's get together. Let's get the heart pumping, etc. And really, I think it just builds rapport. It builds team team morale and so on and so forth. So I think you just need to again, be transparent, be human, give opportunities for people to connect together. And I think those are the things that we sort of thrive on at Finmo.
That's very useful. I think as I find that as a growing startup, this is typically the next challenge. Once you start operating sufficiently, you say, right, now is the right point for us to grow the team. It's easier said than done, and then you grow the team and you get into these discussions. More people to manage different reporting lines, being a little bit hands off as a founder, which is eventually what you want to achieve. You need to be a little bit redundant from the servicing role and everything. And I think that's I think it's probably where a lot of young startups are facing these challenges. So best practices here are obviously helpful. On the topic, I mean, this is more from our curiosity because So do you put in place any programs like ESOPs or participation?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, for sure. And sorry, I was going to touch on that. I think one of the things that we have an early sort of philosophy about is people coming to Finmo should feel like they've got a vested interest in ensuring that we all grow together and can achieve new heights and so on and so forth. So absolutely, we had implemented an ESOP program from kind of day one.
Okay.
And joiners that would join would have a variety of options available to them as part of their kind of induction to Finmo, and we still continue that, and we believe very strongly in that, because again, if you think about the first point that I kind of talked about, which comes back to alignment, like these types of incentive programs align the thinking as to how and what to execute, right? And so for us, structure around the planning process, structure around the incentives to achieve those objectives, incentives to grow with Finmo, so innovate in your own space, but also cross-functionally and things like that. We definitely promote. So yes, absolutely, we're a big believer of kind of the ESOP programs, incentives, promoting kind of that cross-functional kind of innovation.
Yeah, so thinking about this from day one allows it to still continue and when we grow. David, thank you very much for this exchange. I thought it was very, very helpful. We talked about compliance, we talked about treasury, not necessarily the most, I would say broad subjects out there. But I think, looking at it from a product standpoint and what it solves and how it's a little bit underserved and underappreciated these are topics I actually like to talk about. Thank you very much for your insights. It was also extremely helpful to hear more about Finmo. We use Finmo for some of our solutions. It's working quite well. I'm hoping that this is going to continue and we are going to scale with the solutions that you provide. Again, thank you very much for joining us. I'm sure this would have been extremely helpful to our audience. And I look forward to meeting you when you come into Singapore, I believe, later this month.
Absolutely. No, thanks for having me, Ollie. It's great to chat.